The bright studio lights of CNN illuminated the debate stage where Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett faced off against Harvard law legend Alan Dershowitz. The air was thick with tension as cameras zoomed in on Crockett's calm but focused expression. Moments earlier, Dershowitz had finished his long defense of presidential immunity, speaking with the confidence of a man certain of his expertise in constitutional law. "No one," he declared proudly, "can challenge my consistent interpretation of executive privilege over my 50-year career." Crockett leaned forward, microphone in hand, a faint but knowing smile forming. A former public defender and civil rights attorney, she wasn't intimidated by Dershowitz's decades of fame or his academic reputation. She waited for silence to fall before asking one sharp question, one that stopped him cold. The color drained from his face, and for perhaps the first time in his long career, the professor was left speechless. The audience gasped, murmuring in disbelief as the cameras caught his frozen expression live. It wasn't just a debate moment. It was a defining event that would dominate social media within minutes. Before we break down this explosive CNN confrontation, tell us where you're watching from. And make sure to like and subscribe for more updates on major political debates and fiery Washington showdowns. Alan Dershowitz looked composed under the lights, his silver hair and signature glasses framing the image of a distinguished legal scholar. At 85, the Harvard professor emeritus carried himself with the poise of someone who had argued before the Supreme Court and represented icons like O.J. Simpson and Donald Trump. The cameras captured his sharp suit and his commanding gestures. "I've defended constitutional principles for more than 5 decades, he said confidently. "My view on presidential powers has never changed, no matter who occupies the Oval Office." The CNN special, titled Presidential Powers, The Constitutional Crisis, had been heavily promoted amid heated national debate about executive privilege and Supreme Court rulings. The stakes were high, and millions were watching to understand where the boundaries of presidential authority truly lie. Across from Dershowitz sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, representing Texas's 30th District. At 42, she was still new to Congress, but already well known for her viral committee moments and fearless courtroom-style questioning. Her bold blue suit stood out under the lights, and her composed demeanor reflected the confidence of a woman ready for battle. Crockett represented a new era of leadership, sharp, prepared, and unwilling to be talked down to. "Congresswoman Crockett, you've been a strong critic of expanding presidential power," the moderator began. "What's your core concern?" Crockett adjusted her mic and spoke clearly. "My concern is simple: equal justice under law. Those words are carved into the Supreme Court building for a reason. No American should ever be above the law, whether they live in public housing or the White House." The audience applauded as Dershowitz waved a hand dismissively. "That's a nice slogan, Congresswoman," he replied. "But it shows a misunderstanding of how our Constitution separates powers. The presidency is unique." Crockett didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled, eyes locked on him. Her team had spent weeks studying his past interviews and legal writings. She had identified the one contradiction that could unravel his entire argument. As the debate cut to a commercial break, viewers could feel something big was coming. Even CNN producers whispered backstage about the undeniable intensity between the two. This wasn't just politics, it was a generational clash between old authority and rising power. Neither the audience nor Dershowitz realized that Crockett was preparing to spring a trap, a single question that would expose the weakness at the core of his claim. When the cameras returned, the moderator turned to Dershowitz. "Professor, you've written extensively about presidential immunity. Could you summarize your position for our viewers?" "Gladly," he said. "The Constitution grants the president unique authority as head of the executive branch. While no one is above the law, the president must enjoy limited immunity to govern effectively. I've stood by this position my entire career, no matter the party in power." Crockett raised her eyebrows ever so slightly but stayed silent, letting the professor continue. "The founders," Dershowitz explained confidently, "designed a system where the proper response to presidential misconduct is impeachment. not criminal prosecution. His tone grew stronger as he went on, clearly enjoying the spotlight. This has been my unwavering position throughout my 50 years of studying the Constitution. The moderator turned to Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. Congresswoman, your response? Professor Dershowitz talks a lot about consistency, Crockett began, her tone measured but firm. But I'd like to examine a few examples that seem to tell a different story. During the Clinton impeachment, you said that high crimes didn't have to be actual criminal offenses. Yet, during Trump's first impeachment, you argued the exact opposite. How do you explain that contradiction? The audience murmured as Dershowitz shifted in his seat, visibly uncomfortable. That's a mischaracterization of my position, he said defensively. In the Clinton case, I was referring to the historical interpretation of high crimes and misdemeanors. During Trump's impeachment, I addressed whether the specific charges met that definition. Crockett smiled faintly, opening a neatly organized folder. I have your direct quotes right here, Professor. In 1998, you said, and I quote, "Impeachment doesn't have to be based on a crime if someone corrupts the office itself." Yet in 2019, you said the opposite, that impeachment requires conduct comparable to a crime. That sounds like a clear contradiction. Dershowitz's face flushed slightly. Context matters, Congresswoman, he replied tightly. Those statements were about entirely different legal questions, were they? Crockett asked calmly. Because it looks like the only thing that changed was which party held the White House. The crowd responded with scattered applause. Dershowitz's jaw set as he leaned toward his microphone. I've spent my life defending constitutional principles, not partisan politics, he said sharply. Unlike some politicians, I don't change my opinions to follow polls. My views are grounded in consistent interpretation of our founding document. The moderator, sensing the growing heat, tried to steer the discussion back on track. Let's return to the current Supreme Court case about presidential immunity, he suggested. But Crockett wasn't finished. With respect, she said evenly, I'd like to clarify the professor's idea of consistency. Turning back to Dershowitz, she continued, in your 2004 book Rights from Wrongs, you wrote that no president should be shielded from judicial review. Yet, in 2020, during the Senate hearings, you claim that presidents enjoy broad immunity for actions they believe serve the national interest. What changed? Dershowitz's jaw tightened again. You're twisting my words, Congresswoman. In 2004, I was discussing actions outside the president's official duties. In 2020, I was talking about acts clearly within the constitutional scope of the presidency. Crockett flipped another page in her binder. So your stance depends on what counts as an official act? Of course, he snapped. That's basic constitutional law. Official acts are treated differently than personal ones. This isn't controversial among serious legal scholars. Crockett nodded slowly, letting the arrogance settle in the air. And who decides what qualifies as an official act? Ultimately, the courts, he answered. There's long-standing precedent for that. Precedent you've supported and opposed depending on the administration, she noted, her tone even. The room fell tense. In the control booth, CNN producers recognized they were witnessing something extraordinary. Dershowitz, typically composed and professorial, was growing visibly irritated. Crockett, by contrast, was calm and surgical, an attorney meticulously dismantling her opponent. Asterisk. The debate expanded to broader issues of executive power. Crockett presented evidence, quotes, and legal documents for each point, while Dershowitz increasingly leaned on his experience and prestige. Congressman, he said, incorrectly addressing her with all due respect, I've argued before the Supreme Court 9 times. I've taught constitutional law at Harvard for 50 years. These nuances may not be obvious to someone without that background. The audience audibly reacted to his condescending tone. Crockett's face stayed composed, but her eyes narrowed slightly. It's Congresswoman, she corrected calmly. And I'm well aware of your resume, Professor. I'm also aware of an old saying in law, when the facts are on your side, you argue the facts. When the law's on your side, you argue the law. And when neither is on your side, she paused, letting the silence build, you pound the table. The audience erupted in gasps and applause. The moderator, struggling to regain control, called for a commercial break before the final segment. As the cameras went dark, Dershowitz leaned toward his aide, visibly frustrated. "She's performing for the audience, not making legal arguments," he muttered, unaware that nearby microphones had caught every word. Crockett quietly reviewed her notes, her demeanor calm and composed. Her preparation for this moment had been meticulous, and every exchange had unfolded exactly as her team anticipated. The stage was set for the final question, the one Alan Dershowitz could not possibly answer without contradicting his own record. As the show returned from the commercial break, the moderator looked between the two guests. "We're entering our final segment. Professor Dershowitz, you've defended the consistency of your constitutional interpretations. Congresswoman Crockett, you've challenged those claims. Let's give each of you a closing opportunity to present your case." Dershowitz spoke first, his tone scholarly but noticeably strained. "Throughout my career, I've been guided by constitutional principles, not political loyalties," he began. "Yes, legal thought evolves over time, but my foundation has always been steady. The presidency requires certain immunities to function properly, regardless of who occupies the office. Protecting the institution, not the individual, is what truly matters." He gestured confidently toward the audience. "Congresswoman Crockett has selectively quoted my work out of context to imply inconsistency where there is none. It's a familiar tactic when substantive arguments fall short. I stand by every opinion I've offered because each was grounded in constitutional reasoning relevant to its moment." The camera panned to Jasmine Crockett, who nodded politely as he finished. When it was her turn, she thanked the moderator, then turned slightly, addressing both Dershowitz and the audience. "Professor Dershowitz speaks eloquently about consistency and constitutional values," she began, her voice measured yet firm. "But there's one crucial question that still needs an answer." She reached for a document on the table. The studio fell completely silent. "Professor," she continued, "in your 1998 book Sexual McCarthyism, you wrote, and I quote, 'If a president committed murder and claimed it was an official act because the victim posed a national security threat, no one would seriously argue that presidential immunity would protect him from prosecution.' You repeated that point several times in interviews during the Clinton administration." Crockett then looked up directly at him. "Yet, in 2020, during President Trump's impeachment trial, you told the Senate that if a president believes their re-election serves the national interest, then actions taken to secure that re-election cannot be impeachable. You said, quote, 'If a president does something he believes will help him get elected in the public interest, that cannot be the kind of quid pro quo that results in impeachment.'" The room went silent. The camera zoomed in on Dershowitz's face as the weight of the question landed. For a long moment he said nothing, his mouth opened slightly, then closed again. For perhaps the first time in his public career, Alan Dershowitz appeared truly speechless. The audience held its breath. Even the moderator, clearly stunned, hesitated to speak. Finally, Dershowitz attempted to respond. That's an outrageous distortion of my argument. Obviously, murder would be—" "I'm quoting your exact words, Professor," Crockett interjected calmly. "In 1998, you said presidential murder could not be protected by immunity. In 2020, you said actions taken to secure re-election, if believed to serve the national interest, cannot be impeachable. Those are two entirely different standards. So which one represents your actual position?" Dershowitz's face reddened. "You're creating a false choice, Congresswoman. No serious reading of my 2020 statement would ever include something as extreme as murder." "But your argument didn't include any limitation," Crockett pressed, her tone still even. "You claim that any action taken for re-election in the name of national interest is beyond impeachment. You didn't specify exceptions. So where exactly is your line, and why did it shift so dramatically between 1998 and 2020? The studio was silent again as Dershowitz visibly struggled to form a coherent response. "The contexts were entirely different," he stammered. "The only thing that changed," Crockett replied, "was the party of the president." The audience gasped, followed by an eruption of applause. The camera zoomed in on Dershowitz's stunned expression as he realized he had walked right into her carefully planned trap. It's a cheap shot, he managed, his composure faltering. My career has been dedicated to defending civil liberties across party lines. Your record, Crockett countered, is exactly what I'm questioning, not your education or experience, but your consistency on the most fundamental constitutional question of all. The American people deserve to know whether your interpretation of presidential power depends on who holds the office. The audience erupted again. Recognizing that they had just witnessed a moment destined to dominate headlines across the nation, the moderator, aware of the historic weight of what was unfolding live on air, chose not to interrupt. He allowed the exchange to continue, sensing this was a moment that would be remembered. Dershowitz tried to regain control of the discussion. Congresswoman, your question builds on a hypothetical that twists my actual position, he began. Voice shaky but attempting composure. It's not a hypothetical. Professor, Crockett cut in sharply, holding up a folder of papers. I'm quoting your own recorded words. In 1998, you clearly stated that a president committing murder could not claim immunity. In 2020, you argued that any action taken in the name of re-election, if the president believes it's in the national interest, is not impeachable. These two positions cannot coexist. The camera zoomed in on Dershowitz's face as the contradiction hit him in real time. His long-cultivated image of constitutional consistency, the very core of his reputation, was collapsing in front of millions of viewers. I would need to review the full context of those statements, he finally muttered, his confidence visibly eroding. I have the full transcripts right here, Crockett replied evenly, patting the folder on the desk. Would you like me to read more? The audience erupted in applause and gasps. The CNN moderator, realizing the exchange would dominate headlines for days, finally stepped in. We need to wrap up. Professor Dershowitz, your final response. Straightening his tie, Dershowitz tried to steady himself. The Congresswoman is engaging in political theater with issues far more complex than this debate allows. Anyone who studies constitutional law understands that context matters. My arguments have evolved through deeper legal understanding, not partisanship. But the usual confidence was gone? Even casual viewers could see he had avoided the question. The moderator turned to Crockett. Congresswoman, your closing thoughts? Crockett nodded and looked straight into the camera. The Constitution is not a political tool to be bent by whoever holds power. Equal justice under law must mean exactly that equal. When our top legal voices shift their interpretations depending on party affiliation, public faith in our democracy crumbles. This isn't a partisan issue. It's an American one. She turned back to Dershowitz. Professor, I respect your years of scholarship. But on this question, on presidential power, the people deserve clarity and consistency, not theories that change with political winds. As the moderator closed the segment, it was clear the damage was done. Alan Dershowitz, long revered for his legal intellect, had been publicly cornered by his own words. And Jasmine Crockett, armed only with transcripts and precision, had done what few ever managed. She left the Harvard icon completely speechless. Moments after the broadcast ended, the internet exploded. The phrase "Crockett destroys Dershowitz" trended across platforms. The 45-second clip showing his stunned silence spread like wildfire, racking up millions of views within the first hour. Major outlets quickly picked up the story. On MSNBC, Rachel Maddow replayed the full exchange and remarked, "What we witnessed tonight was remarkable." Congresswoman Crockett exposed a core contradiction in Professor Dershowitz's arguments that even he couldn't reconcile. Even Fox News, where Dershowitz had often appeared as a contributor, struggled to defend him, regardless of political leaning, one analyst said. Failing to answer that central question is deeply concerning for someone of Dershowitz's stature. Inside the CNN studio, energy buzzed long after the cameras stopped rolling. Crockett gathered her papers as staff members approached, offering congratulations for what many were already calling a defining moment in modern political discourse. As she walked toward the green room, her phone lit up with messages, texts, alerts, and calls pouring in from colleagues and national figures. One senior Democratic senator messaged, "You did what the entire legal world has tried to do for years." You caught him in his own contradiction, and he had nowhere to run. Meanwhile, Dershowitz exited quickly, avoiding follow-up interviews. His publicist issued a short statement. "Professor Dershowitz appreciates the chance to discuss important constitutional matters. Such issues often demand more nuance than television formats can provide. He looks forward to addressing them in scholarly venues." But the explanation only fueled further criticism. Legal analysts noted that Dershowitz had long used TV appearances to make bold, sweeping claims about presidential power only retreating to academic nuance when challenged. By morning, the confrontation dominated every major newspaper. The New York Times ran the headline, "In a stunning on-air clash, Crockett challenges Dershowitz on presidential power contradictions." The Washington Post went even further. "Dershowitz speechless. How Congresswoman Crockett exposed double standards in constitutional debate." Across universities, law professors began discussing the exchange in classrooms. At Harvard Law, where Dershowitz had taught for decades, students organized a special symposium titled "Constitutional Consistency: The Crockett Question." The political impact of the debate was enormous. Jasmine Crockett, already seen as a fast-rising figure in progressive politics, suddenly found herself being discussed as a potential Senate candidate and even a future presidential contender. Her precise, disciplined dismantling of one of America's most renowned constitutional lawyers displayed an uncommon blend of intellect and strategic skill rarely seen in modern politics. "What made this moment historic," explained one CNN political analyst, "wasn't just that Congresswoman Crockett challenged Professor Dershowitz. It's that she used his own words to reveal a deep inconsistency that had existed in his arguments for decades. She didn't insult him personally or rely on theatrics. She simply let his record expose itself." 3 days after the televised exchange, Dershowitz tried to repair the damage by publishing an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal titled, "Textual Constitutional Interpretation is Not Inconsistency," but the attempt backfired. The comment section was quickly filled with variations of Crockett's still unanswered question. While legal scholars across blogs and news outlets methodically picked apart his explanations, within a week, CNN announced that the debate had become their most viewed clip of the year, surpassing 15 million views across platforms. The phrase "pulling a Crockett" entered popular political vocabulary, meaning to corner an opponent using their own contradictory statements. For Jasmine Crockett, the aftermath brought both opportunity and new responsibility. Interview requests poured in from major networks. Democratic leaders began including her in high-level constitutional briefings. Her donor base exploded, powered by small contributions from across the country by viewers inspired by her composure and intellect. "What we witnessed wasn't just a political victory," said a respected constitutional scholar during a Harvard panel discussion. "It was a reaffirmation that accountability still matters. When public figures change their principles to serve partisan goals, they should be challenged exactly as Congresswoman Crockett did." Even more importantly, the debate reshaped the national conversation about presidential authority and legal consistency. Commentators who once accepted partisan double standards began facing tougher scrutiny. Cable news hosts started confronting guests with their past statements, a practice soon dubbed the Crockett test. 2 weeks later, Crockett appeared on 60 Minutes to reflect on the event and its aftermath. When asked if she had anticipated Dershowitz's inability to answer, she smiled. "I wasn't trying to embarrass Professor Dershowitz," she said calmly. "My goal was to highlight something deeper, a problem in our constitutional dialogue. When our interpretations shift with the political winds, we weaken the very foundation of the rule of law. That's not a partisan issue. That's an American issue." The interviewer pressed further. "But did you know he wouldn't have an answer?" Crockett paused, thoughtful. "I knew he couldn't have a consistent answer," she said. "The contradiction between his 1998 and 2020 positions is simply irreconcilable. What surprised me most was that no one had ever asked him directly to explain that contradiction. As the interview concluded, the correspondent revealed that Professor Dershowitz had declined 60 Minutes' invitation to appear, citing that he was writing a new book exploring constitutional power in more depth. Crockett smiled faintly. "I look forward to reading it," she said. "But constitutional principles shouldn't depend on who sits in the Oval Office. That was true in 1998, it was true in 2020, and it's true today." By that point, the moment had moved far beyond a single televised clash. It had become a defining reference in political and legal circles, a reminder that even the most celebrated experts must be held accountable for intellectual contradictions. For Jasmine Crockett, the exchange marked her evolution from promising freshman lawmaker to a leading national voice on constitutional integrity. For Alan Dershowitz, it represented a rare, humbling reckoning after decades of dominance in public debate. And for the American people, it offered a rare moment of clarity in an often clouded discussion about presidential authority and principle. 6 months later, as the Supreme Court took up a new case on presidential immunity, reporters began asking every major witness and politician a familiar question: would your position be the same if the president were from the opposite party? That question, now widely known as the Crockett Standard, had become the new measure of intellectual honesty in American political life. What began as one pointed question in a CNN debate had evolved into a nationwide call for consistency, principle, and the true meaning of equal justice under law. And as commentators across the spectrum acknowledged, Jasmine Crockett hadn't just won a debate, she had changed the national standard for truth itself.